more lectures and then a optional review session. But for today, we are continuing with our discussion of social problems related to these various topics that you could choose for your public issue project. And I did see that there are a few students, actually I can even call them out in a good way by name. There are several students who have posted their discussion for today's topic. So let's see, where is my screen? There it is. So if you are on the Brightspace page for today, education, and you go to the discussion board, you'll see four of your fellow students have posted topics, presentations about education. So make sure you check those out in the next few days. You don't have to do all four if you don't have time to respond to every single one of your classmates. At least do maybe two of them. But I think these have all been really interesting topics so far. So that'll be part of your assignment this week, just like last time and the time before. But for now, we need to talk about education first. So our topic today is education, and we are talking about both the social problems associated with education in society, as well as some solutions or potential ways forward. Because while there are problems in our current education system, they're not insurmountable. So just briefly, the term education is a general term that just refers to any process that results in learning. Right? Any process resulting in learning. This could be, learning facts, like reading an encyclopedia. Could be learning a skill, like how to fish. Could be learning a new way of thinking. It could be gained through reading, observing, interacting, or experiencing. It doesn't have to happen in a school. Right? And that's the idea, is education is any time you learn. Schooling, on the other hand, is a very specific kind of education. Right? It's a formalized educational process in which an institution, right, a school, delivers a relatively standardized curriculum. So education is any learning experience you might have. When I was little, I remember there was a dog that lived next door to my grandma, and I went to try to pet the dog, and he snarled and snapped at me, scared me, right, knocked me down. I was not in danger in any way, but I, fell down, and I was scared, and I was educated that dog wasn't friendly, right? No school was involved in that, no formal process. That was, traditional trial and error, right? Experiential learning. That dog wasn't friendly. However, most of us in our childhood especially attended some kind of formal educational institution. And schools are the most common, but they're not the only kind of schooling. There's formalized learning at churches, right? Religious institutions, and not just religious schools, but even like regular church has, teaches you about the Bible or whatever, right? That's schooling. Families sometimes have formalized education as part of what they do as a family. Civic entities like the Rotary Club or whatever. Lots of things besides just, public or private schools can engage in schooling. But again, this is still more formal, more specific than just any kind of learning. Fair enough? All right. So, what is the purpose of education? Why does education exist? There's a lot of answers to that question, but sociologists tend to focus on two specific roles of education. Not from the individual's point of view, but from the society's point of view, right? So from an individual's point of view, there's lots of reasons for education, right? So you can learn skills, so you can get a job, so you can make social networks. You know, everybody has personal reasons for education, but I'm talking about, like, why does our society, why do human societies create education? And largely they are to do two things for the society. Those two things are status attainment and social reproduction. That according to sociologists, the main purposes of education in our society are status attainment and social reproduction. So the first one, status attainment. You guys know what a status in society is, right? It's any position that brings with it a certain amount of prestige or respect or whatever, like the status of President of the United States, or the status of kindergarten teacher, or the status of celebrity, or whatever, right? And so status attainment is the process by which we get our statuses, and right, as we live our lives. And education is one of the ways we attain our statuses. I have a status of professor, right? Well, associate professor, technically. But that status, I attained that status as the result of my education, right? I got a PhD, I'm a doctor. That is how I attained my status as professor. So, with the purpose of education is status attainment, schools systematically provide access to knowledge, skills, and credentials that people need to attain status. Or to put it another way, the skills, knowledge, and credentials we need to find suitable, appropriate positions in society. We could do away with the education system, and instead of people learning skills, knowledge, and credentials for different positions, we could just randomly assign them. At birth, people could be born and we would randomly assign, you're going to be a heart surgeon, you're going to be a mechanic, you're going to be a president, right? But if that's how we assign status, then like a lot of unqualified people are going to end up in heart surgery or whatever, right? Or fixing cars that could, save a person's life, or running the country. And so we need to make sure that everybody's in a suitable position for their skills and their talents and their knowledge, right? And so education is the way that we train people, right, to be members of society. Modern societies use compulsory public education, meaning, compulsory means it's mandatory, right? And in the U.S., it is mandatory up to a certain age. In the state of Maine, that age is 16. But anyway, modern societies use compulsory public schooling to train citizens for appropriate occupations. We're literally training people to attain certain statuses later on in their adult lives. So we teach everybody some basic math, right? Because whether you are a clerk at a retail store or a mechanical engineer, right? You're going to need some math, and so we teach everybody some math. And then, of course, you can go on and learn more math depending on what you want to do, what occupation you want to be trained for. But does that make sense, the idea of status attainment? School's job, from this point of view, is to train people to fill all the different positions of society. If you look worldwide at the role of education, that is primarily what it is for. Schools around the world prepare students in various ways. So, for example, I've jotted down some interesting facts here, but in China, students have to attend school for 9 years, so until they're 14. Then they can elect to enroll in either a general secondary school or a vocational secondary school where they get trained for a specific job. In Belgium, they mandate 12 years of school and channel students into distinct kind of high schools, right? The high schools might be, arts oriented or technology oriented or vocationally oriented or whatever. Let's see. In the U.S., every state has different policies, but every state requires somewhere between 8 and 12 years of schooling, right? We expect students to get through between 8th grade and high school education is an expectation in our culture. The other part of status attainment is you don't just get trained for the position, like your job that you're going to do, because I don't know about you, but I know lots of people that haven't always done the same job in their lifetime, right? And so the public school system is also a tool for social mobility in society. If you want to change your position in society, one of the major tools you can use to change your position is education, right? And most of you who are in this class right now are literally doing that right now, right? You are educating yourselves in order to increase your opportunities for mobility, to move around in the social structure, to be richer, to be smarter, to be classier, whatever that means, something, right? And so our education system teaches us common ideals, right? Things that we all can agree on or share in common. And by doing that, education supports political and social stability in society. You've probably seen in the news recently, there's this big uproar about teaching something called critical race theory in schools. And people are up in arms about what their kids are being taught or not taught or whatever. And this is not new. I mean, critical race theory is the current boogeyman this year, but back in the day it was, books that had swear words in them, and everybody was up in arms about high school students reading, Huck Finn or whatever. And there's always something. And the idea is people get upset about what's taught in schools because those are situations where they don't feel we're teaching common ideals, right? Some group is upset about what's getting taught in schools, and so they create, instability in society while they try to get it changed. And so there's an uproar right now about this thing called critical race theory, which is not taught in high schools, by the way. It's a graduate school level theory. But anyway, but people are afraid that if we're teaching something that's uncommon, that's not our agreed upon story of America, right, then there will be instability because everybody won't be on the same page. And ultimately, that's education's goal, is to get everybody on the same page, at least starting out in the world, right? So because we see instability when people don't share ideals, we can postulate that an efficient, effective education system is a fundamental precursor for a successful, efficient society. An efficient, effective educational system is a precursor to a successful society. In other words, if our education system is not efficient and effective, our society is not going to be living up to its standards, right? So problems in education are problems for the larger society. Does that argument make sense about status attainment, that one purpose of schools from society's points of view is to train people to attain a status? Good? All right. But there is another function of schooling, of our education system, that sociologists identify, and that is called social reproduction. So think of the word reproduction. You're not well, I guess it is also about having children, babies, right? But I literally mean reproducing something, making something again. Reproducing, making something again. And so what social reproduction is the idea that if society looks a certain way, okay, it looks like this is society, let's say, that our education system is designed to create a new society that looks exactly the same, right? To produce a new, like with the next generation, to produce another society that's just like the one before it. So we all went through education, and we look a certain way. The role of education in the next generation is to produce another round of us again, right? Another generation that knows the same things and believes the same things and does the same things, right? From society's point of view, that's good, right? Because society can be reproduced, it can live on, right? The problem is the society that we've got here, right, has flaws. We've learned all semester about the flaws of society. And so if education's job is to reproduce society, then it's going to reproduce the problems too, right? And so that's the argument here, that education, schools, are organizations that actually just reproduce the social stratification that we see in the larger society. We've got social classes in society. We've got upper class, we've got lower class, right? Schools are upper class and lower class. Think of private schools and public schools, or the nicer neighborhood schools versus the poorer neighborhood schools. There's a class system in schools. Race is addressed in schools, right? Or there's schools that have a lot of diversity, and there's schools that don't have any at all. Gender is reinforced in schools. Sexuality, deviance, right? Everything we've talked about in society that leads to stratification gets reproduced in schools. And so what's happening is that instead of designing educational experiences around each child's aptitudes and interests, schools use students' social locations to determine where they belong in society. Instead of designing educational experiences around each child, right, in an ideal world with infinite money and teachers and everything, every child would have their own tailored school experience, right? But we know that's not going to happen. We haven't had that since before the one-room schoolhouse, right? The problem is that our solution is to use students' social locations to predetermine what kind of lessons they're going to get and what kind of skills they're going to learn. And so we have a situation that emerges where schools that serve low-income students, schools that are in poor and inner-city neighborhoods and rural areas, schools serving low-income students emphasize lessons on things like discipline or obedience, whereas schools that serve high-income students often promote things like individuality or critical thinking or creativity, right? These low-income students are getting lessons on how to follow directions in their future career as a worker, right? Whereas the high-income students are getting lessons about innovating and leading and managing, right? These kinds of students, the low-income students. Because the schools, just by being in a low-income or high-income neighborhood, are predetermining where their students are expected to end up in society. And so if you are a lower class, live in a lower class neighborhood, you will get a school experience that teaches you how to be a lower class citizen. Whereas if you are an upper class student living in a high income area, you will get a high income school experience that teaches you how to be a leader, right? And so this is the very idea that schools are just reproducing more of the same, right? You go in poor, you come out poor. You go in rich, you come out rich. Same thing. Does that make sense? The argument of social reproduction, that schools actually, we want them to be status attainment. We want to be able to use them to, move around in society. And on the individual level, you kind of can. But then in the big picture, schools are just reproducing the same structure that they were created in. So one of the approaches that deals with this idea of social reproduction is called critical pedagogy, which sounds very fancy. Critical just means, you challenge things, right? And pedagogy is the philosophy of teaching. So challenging the way things are taught And basically, critical pedagogy is the belief that teaching and learning are inherently political acts. That it's political not because it's Democrat or Republican. I don't mean like partisan. I mean that by the act of teaching and the act of learning is something that can strengthen or weaken a democracy, right? It is something that can strengthen or weaken the like very fabric of a society, right? And so it is political in nature because the masses, everybody, has access to education. We have differing levels of access and quality, but education is a tool that the masses can use to challenge the status quo. So status quo is a Latin term that means the way things are. The way things are. And so if you want to challenge the status quo, that means you want to challenge the way things are. And so education is a tool that you can use to challenge, the man, if you will, right? For example, before the Civil War, during slavery primarily, those who were owned by white people, right? Those people who were enslaved, it was illegal for them to read, right? That was a law in the South at the time. And so enslaved people in the American South would secretly pursue literacy and learning, right, and at night and hidden. And they risked their lives to do so, right, to learn to read. That tells us how important literacy is. That's a political act, right? Defying the law, risking your life to learn to read. Because literacy and learning to read laid the foundation for all the writing and dissemination of slave narratives and protest pamphlets and all those things that eventually fueled the abolition movement that overturned the institution of slavery, right? If they hadn't engaged in that very political act of challenging the status quo, that they weren't allowed to read, and reading anyway, right, we may never have seen that social change. And so, to make a long story short, the philosophy of teaching that many educators, myself included, try to espouse is that teachers' overarching goal should be to help learners develop critical consciousness. Not just memorizing dates and names, right? We want our students to learn critical consciousness, the ability to enact change in your everyday life through political critique and social action. I don't sit here twice a week, and complain about all the problems in society to hear myself talk, right? I want people to be angry and motivated to change some of these things as you go out into the world with your new education and your ability to enact change and to fix some of these problems out there, right? So, to these two arguments, status attainment being one way that schools operate, right, for us to train people to get a status in society. But then also, schools are also just reproducing the same system that already exists. Those two things make sense to you? All right, so what I'd like to focus on next, and for most of today, is the some of the problems in our education system, because even if it's designed to reproduce stratification, there's a lot of other issues that go along with our education system. And not just our education system in the United States, but education, around the world. So one of the major problems worldwide when it comes to education is accessibility, determining where and to whom schooling is available. And so we might think of school as being somewhat accessible, right? In fact, it's the law in the United States that you have to attend school. It's hard to get out of it. As a kid, you probably remember wishing that you didn't have access to school, but you did, right? But worldwide, it's more of a challenge. And in fact, the United Nations has come out declaring education a fundamental human right. a fundamental human right, just like access to clean water and freedom from enslavement. And, there's the UN has a whole list of human rights, of fundamental human rights, but education is one of them because we as humans need it. Even so, over 263 million children and adolescents, 1 in every 5 youth around the world were out of school in 2016. So this is a graph of the number of kids out of school, like not accessing school. This is the year 2000, and over here is 2016. And as you can see, over the last 16 years, like more kids are in school because fewer kids are out of school, right? And the way it breaks down is the bottom 2 tiers are elementary, middle, and high school. And so you can see high schools have the largest chunk, right? Because lots of kids don't go to high school around the world, but most kids go to elementary, right? And then they break it down by gender, which we'll talk about in just a second, that because boys are given more access to school worldwide than girls are. But in general, these are the breakdowns. So you can see more kids are in school now than were in the past, but there are still 263 million kids not in school every day. So many countries and cultures view education as more important or more appropriate for boys than for girls. And that's why if you, that chart, by the way, that I just shared was from the book. So if you look at that more carefully, you'll see that the bar, the lines for the girls is thicker, it has more girls in it than there are boys. More girls are out of school than boys are. Some places around the world prohibit, adolescent girls from even attending school if they're menstruating or if they're expected to be taking care of, an ailing relative or something. Whereas boys are generally expected to go to school. Another issue worldwide that's something that we don't think about a lot in the U.S. is what about places where there are armed conflicts or wars going on, right? School gets disrupted for children. Again, in many lifetimes in the United States, we have not experienced that. There has not been an armed conflict on U.S. soil in many, many years. But during the Syrian civil war in Syria, the number of out-of-school children went from like 100,000 to like 2 million. Most of the children in Syria were out of school for 2 years as this, war was going on. Many families became refugees and fled. And then, as a refugee, you go to a new country, you certainly don't immediately start enrolling your kids in school, and they don't immediately necessarily understand what's going on if it's a country with a different language or whatever, right? And so as of 2017, which is 4 to 5 years after the war ended, only half of school-aged Syrian refugees were actually back in school. People talk about schooling during the Holocaust, especially in Europe, right? If anyone has relatives or friends who lived through that, they talk about school being out for weeks at a time, in London after the bombing and the Blitzkrieg, right, and things like that. And so places with political unrest, especially students' progress and access to school can be totally disrupted. We certainly saw that with the coronavirus outbreak on a different scale, right? Not an armed conflict, but a global pandemic disrupted school for a lot of the spring of last year until we got remote schooling under our belts, and then kind of got kids back into that swing of things, and most people were not super educators. We're not super worried that, okay, kids missed a few months of school, right? Maybe even a semester of school, but compared to kids around the world, who end up just fine, it's okay, for kids to have had a disrupted semester or a year. We'll get them through it, So accessibility is a big issue in education, making sure that everyone has access to an education. But just getting an education doesn't solve everything either. There's a lot of inequality among schools, right? Schools vary greatly in their quality. A classic example of this that's used in general discussion is comparing the difference between public schools and private schools, right? So public schools are government funded and are subject to government regulations, right? The Department of Education. Oops, sorry, hang on, I just slipped, there we go. Private schools, on the other hand, private schools they operate independent of government funding and government regulation. So private schools pay their own way, or they charge tuition, right? They don't get outside funding from the government, but that means that they don't have to abide by government regulations, right? So why might people choose public schools? Private schools. Traditionally, many private schools are rooted in various religious traditions, right? Like Catholic schools or other kinds of, church-tied schools or synagogue or temple or whatever. But so many parents choose private schools so that their children can have an education that's tied to their religion. There's also a perception in the larger public that private schools are more academically rigorous, that they are somehow a better education. Turns out, by the way, private schools are more rigorous in terms of acceptance, right? It's hard to get into them, but the actual content delivered in classes in private schools and public schools is largely the same. In fact, in some cases, it's less rigorous at private schools because they're not subject to government regulations requiring certain curriculum or certain, outcomes or whatever. But that being said, there's a perception that that private schools are better somehow, right? Private schools in the United States tend to enroll wealthy white students. And so there is data that shows in the book lists what the studies are. I don't know them off the top of my head, but private schools in the United States, on average, enroll disproportionate numbers of white students. So they're more heavily white. They disproportionately enroll students from high-earning or highly educated households. And they regularly enroll fewer English language learners or students with disabilities. Public schools enroll more people of color. They enroll more students from non-high earning or high educated backgrounds. And they enroll more English language learners or students with disabilities and that sort of thing. For example, private schools don't participate in the federally funded free lunch or reduced lunch programming, right? Public schools do, right? But so low-income families that need a reduced or free lunch can't send their kids to private school, even if the tuition is, waived or whatever, right? Like, they need the other supports that participating in government funding gets them. And along the lines of students with disabilities, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the IDEA Act, the IDEA Act from 2004. It's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And basically it's the policy that guarantees all students access to public, free and public education regardless of their learning ability. Private schools are not covered by that. They are not held subject to the IDEA Act, the IDEA Act. And oftentimes private schools are not as well equipped to meet the needs of individual students. At a public school, students have to be evaluated if a teacher suspects a learning disability. They get what's called an individualized education plan, an IEP, right, that outlines how there'll be treatment, or not treatment, but support and that kind of thing. But only a very small number of private schools actually use and do IEPs with their students. Most don't because they're not required to. To access a full range of special education services, most students in the U.S. have to actually attend traditional public school to access it. The best special ed programs in the country are public school programs, not private school ones. So, there is inequality among schools when it comes to public and private, but even if we're just looking at public schools, right, there's a huge variation in different public schools, right? And that's largely due to how schools are funded. In the United States, public schools receive funding from 3 levels, right? The local level, the state level, and the federal level. However, they're tied to geography. They're tied to like the neighborhood and the general area around there. We'll get to that in a second. But even if we just look at how much does the U.S. spend on education as a whole, right? Not state by state or whatever, just as a whole. We measure that through something called per pupil spending. Per pupil spending. I'm going to say it wrong. It's a tongue twister for me, but per pupil spending is the average dollar amount spent on each student per year. So if your school, buys a laptop for you and pays your teacher, 1/30 of their salary is for you and all that, right, they add it up and it's $8,000 a year is what your school spends, per student, right? So here is a graph, very hard to read, don't worry, but this is all the different countries in the world and where they stand on how much they spend per student. So the country that spends the most per student is Luxembourg. They have a lot of money and they spend a lot of it on their students. But the U.S. falls right, here's the United States and there's a line. It's like one of these 2 dots right here. So it's like firmly in the middle, right? We, a little higher than the average of most of the countries, right, which is right here, we're up here, spend a little bit more per student. If you look at it by state, this is another graph from the book that I hate because the color coding doesn't make any sense. Usually it's, again, shades of the same color. But Maine spends about an average, right in the middle, a little on the upper end of the middle, right, per student across the U.S. But as you can see, we spend less per student than the rest of the Northeast. New England and the Northeast tend to spend more per student than we do in Maine. That being said, we spend more than a lot of the rest of the country. Right. The U.S. has the highest per pupil spending rate of any northern country, global north country, which is north of the equator, so Europe and North America primarily. Arizona, for example, spends, what am I looking at here? Oh, never mind. I'm sorry. Never mind. Ignore Arizona. It was a note to myself. Anyway, so you get the idea, right? So funding, as I said, primarily comes from government for public schools. And the way the government gets the money for public schools is through local property taxes. For the vast majority of public schools in the United States, local property taxes generate the greatest proportion of funding. And so, as a direct result of that, the property values in a neighborhood determine the quality of the schools in that neighborhood, right? Schools in wealthier districts tend to be well funded because there's lots of property taxes, right? The properties are expensive and the taxes are lucrative. But in poorer districts, where the properties are not valued very highly, or there's a lot of, apartments or not single family homes that pay property taxes, right? Those districts tend to be very underfunded. Not just inner cities though, also very rural areas, right? If there's not a lot of people in the area, it doesn't matter how much they pay in taxes, there's just not going to be as much tax money to go around in that district, right? And so we have a very clear bias And again, here, the word bias just means something that's systematically tilted in one favor or another. And we have, because of property taxes being the basis of school funding, we have a bias, a tilt in favor of places that have better property taxes, right? Better property values and higher taxes. So this is where we get the idea of rich schools and poor schools. And this is just in public school. We're not even talking about private schools anymore, right? And so as you can imagine, I don't think it's hard, and the book goes into more detail than I'm going to, but when there are funding disparities between these richer and poorer schools, that affects a lot of different things, right? It affects the quality of the education that's provided. If your school can afford to take you on field trips to get hands-on learning, or invite scholars and speakers to come teach you firsthand, versus poorer schools that are still using film strips that talk about our 48 United States or whatever, right? The quality of the education is very different depending on funding. Health and mental health for students and faculty and staff, right, are always much higher in well-funded schools than in poorer schools. The quality of the meals provided to students, more well-rounded. They don't have to call ketchup a vegetable, right, when they can afford to buy organic produce for their students. Mental health, wealthier schools can afford to hire psychologists and things, and not just have, one guy whose job it is to go to 50 schools every month, and see every student. So those kinds of things. And then, of course, teacher salaries, which you might think, well, who cares what the teachers are making? But inexperienced teachers who are just starting out get lower pay, right, because of seniority. And so poorly funded schools tend to be staffed by newbies, right, by just out of training teachers who are getting lower pay, right? Once people start getting seniority and earning more money, they go elsewhere because the school can't afford to pay them anymore. And so there's always a steady stream of substitutes and part-time teachers because nobody wants to do the job for as little pay as they're being offered. So if we are able to raise teacher salaries, we can attract more well-qualified, responsible people who are more eager to actually teach, right? So that's why salaries are on here. Questions or comments about any of that? So funding is an issue for schools as well. Thirdly is segregation. So most of us, when we hear about school segregation, we picture the 1950s and 60s, right? But schools are still segregated today. So because of our system of local property taxes funding schools, U.S. public schools automatically enroll students from the surrounding local neighborhood, right? Based on, census records or whatever, right? They know who are the school-age children that live in this district, and they automatically are enrolled in that school. Well, we learned back when we talked about race and ethnicity and when we talked about social class that entire neighborhoods tend to be segregated by race and class, right? That, we tend to associate with people who are like us, and we get neighborhoods where they are, quote unquote, black neighborhoods or Latino neighborhoods or, Italian neighborhoods or whatever. And so because schools get their students from local neighborhoods, you have public schools that are mostly black or mostly white or whatever, right? Because the neighborhoods are that way. And so for a long time, the U.S. government tried to artificially desegregate schools, right? So we knew that, left to our own devices, we tend to segregate ourselves into neighborhoods. And if schools are based in neighborhoods, then the schools are going to be segregated too. So in the 1960s and 70s, there was all this desegregation, right? Where students would, a school would look at their student body and they would decide what the makeup should be, right? A good mix of students. And students were assigned to different schools based on that instead of based on what their address was. And they were bused to their assigned school. That successfully diversified schools, and it improved student outcomes, especially in very heavily segregated places like the South and things like that. There was a lot of desegregation busing. Whoops, sorry. Hang on. Desegregation busing. However, by the 1990s, the federal government eliminated the mandatory requirement for school districts to reevaluate their racial makeup and bus students in when they need to. And since the 1990s, schools have resegregated very quickly and are still, there are many, many schools that are predominantly white or predominantly, black or Latino or whatever, based on the surrounding neighborhoods. So one solution to that was proposed in the 90s was magnet schools. Magnet schools are public schools that anyone can attend, right? But they have specialized programming or curricula, a magnet school, arts, based on performing arts, or a magnet school for technology. They're typically located in minority neighborhoods and poorer neighborhoods, but they attract students from outside just that neighborhood. And so magnet schools tend to have a very good mix of, local and outside students, and so they tend to be more diverse and more desegregated. Questions about any of these? So if the segregation is coming from our policy that schools should be based on neighborhoods, right? Maybe that's the problem. Because now the neighborhood argument has had a problem with funding, right? That's not helping with funding, and it's having a problem with segregation. So some places have tried open enrollment policies, where basically children can enroll in any public school in the area as long as that school has open seats, right? Every school can only take so many students, so we'll say every school has 1,000 open seats, and that any student can enroll in any of those schools as long as there's an opening. This process, this open enrollment policy, reduced segregation, and largely it shifted decision-making away from the government, because the government is who decides what school you go to, right? The government says, oh, you live in this neighborhood, you're going to this local school. Well, by having open enrollment policies, it takes that decision away from the government and gives it back to the family. And the family can decide where they want their child to go to school, right? This is great in urban locations where there's lots and lots of schools in an area, or in well-funded districts which are the schools that everybody wants to go to, right? But choices are disproportionately available in certain locations, right? It's very hard to find, in a rural area, right? There might be 2 or 3 schools that are an option, and they're all poorly funded because of, the nature of the area. And so this sounds like a good idea, and it works in certain situations, but not all. In fact, it can even be used as a mechanism for white flight, which is where middle-class white families, they opt out of their neighborhood schools when the schools are starting to serve a larger proportion of people of color or low-income students or whatever. And so either wealthy or middle-class or white families use open enrollment policies to get their kids out of the schools they don't want them in, right? As opposed to using them to find the school you want. Questions or comments about any of these issues among schools? Funding issues, public versus private issues, segregation issues, do those all make sense? So I want to zoom in a little bit then and look at problems within schools. So what are the problems that individual schools face, right? Like students within schools. Sorry, I was very thirsty. So one situation where we see inequality emerging even within schools is through the process of tracking. So tracking, or academic tracking, because we're talking about schools, involves placing students on particular educational pathways. So like in my high school, we had a couple different tracks. We had like the honors or AP track, right? And so some students would get on that track and they would take, a lot of honors and AP classes. We also had the sort of general track, for most students who just, wanted to get their diploma. And then there was, we had something called the VOTEC track, which was vocational and technological education. And so those were for students who wanted training like in a specific field, like auto mechanic or computer engineering or whatever. And so students they got to choose. It wasn't like you got assigned one of those, but if you had good grades, right, you'd go into the honors track, or if you, already knew what you wanted to do for a job, you might go into the VOTEC path or whatever. That is called explicit tracking. Explicit tracking guides students into certain areas of study. And so, we as students, we largely could choose. I mean, if you were, a terrible student at math and you wanted to go into the honors track for math, they might have said, you shouldn't do that. You should go in the general. But like in general, the student had control over which track they were going in, right? But many schools engage in what's called implicit tracking, and this is like kind of under the radar, right? It occurs when unconscious biases connect race, class, or gender to assumptions about students' academic interests and aptitudes. Unconscious biases connecting race, class, or gender to assumptions about students' academic interests and aptitudes. So, for example, my mom is a baby boomer. She graduated high school in 1968, I believe. And she remembers in high school going to the guidance counselor's office to talk about going to college. And the guidance counselor said, well, you're a girl, you don't need to go to college. Right? And she was like, oh, yeah, I do. I'm going to college, right? And he said, oh, why? Do you want to be a nurse or a teacher? Right? That was it. The guidance counselor for the school, oh, did you want to be a nurse or a teacher? Now, it turned out she wanted to be a teacher. So it worked out for her. But that idea, now that was like a little bit more sexist. Today, it's more implicit, where like we assume that women want to do more helping profession kinds of things, right? And we assume that men maybe want to do more like technical or mathematical kinds of things, right? Female students being directed towards caring professions or away from higher ed. This still happens, right? This isn't, my mom in the 60s was like an overt example of some, stuffy old man being like, you want to be a nurse or a teacher? But like, in its own way, it's still happening today, right? Or, lower class students maybe who haven't ever had any good opportunities being discouraged from trying, or being discouraged from putting themselves out there. Oh, you don't want to apply to Harvard, you'll never get in, you can't afford it anyway, you should just apply to the community college or whatever, right? Like those kinds of, it's not the guidance counselor trying to be a jerk, they're just trying to be realistic, but that's tracking, that's telling a student that that's their path, whether they want it or not, right? So that's one way that there could be inequality in schools, that, people get tracked into various pathways that may or may not be good for them. Another problem in schools happens, especially in it happens throughout school, but elementary, middle school especially. There are disparities in how kids are disciplined in schools. So there is a lot of research done on something called the school-to-prison pipeline, which is a situation where students who are people of color, right? Students of color have an increased likelihood of arrest and incarceration when they have gotten in trouble in schools as a student. So a lot of schools criminalize misbehavior, right? It used to be, if you were, I don't know, disruptive to school in class, you'd go stand in the corner, or you'd have to go to the principal's office, or whatever, right? A lot of schools now are criminalizing simple misbehavior and calling in school resource officers or other pseudo law enforcement, right? I'm not saying they call the police on a kid for making jokes or whatever, but they're more likely to involve the police, which the earlier that children are exposed to, police and law enforcement as a negative authority figure, right? The more likely they are to, down the line, have negative experiences with law enforcement after school, right? So a lot of this is because of zero tolerance policies. Zero tolerance policies attach strict and unwavering punishment to any behavior interpreted as potentially dangerous. Now, on its face, that sounds like a good thing. I wouldn't want my kids exposed to danger in school. Like that, I don't want that, right? But zero tolerance means that the context doesn't matter, right? And that automatically students get serious punishments for what might not be serious behavior. So in one example, the NYPD arrested an elementary school children for writing on a desk, for carrying scissors in their backpack, and for disrupting their kindergarten class. Right? 3 arrests made in public schools in New York City. One was a kid for writing on a desk. Now, should that kid be disciplined for writing on a desk? That's misbehavior, sure. Right? Do they need to be arrested? I don't think so. Carrying scissors in a backpack. Now, I get scissors are a weapon, technically, right? And you want to have zero tolerance, no weapons. But then what happens is this, 6-year-old who accidentally brought scissors to school now has this label as a violent criminal, right? Who, is that really, I get why we want these policies, but they end up with ridiculous outcomes, like kindergarteners being arrested, right? And school resource officers, bless them, many of them, right, are trying to toe this line between law enforcement and, actual resource for the students. And, they're playing this role in this criminalization process of little kids, right? Kids have been handcuffed, and schools and physically, restrained in ways for things like having a cell phone or, right, not things that maybe are necessitating. So the point is, while policies like this are intended to make schools safer, they actually deepen inequality because the kinds of students that get in trouble are more likely to be disadvantaged students. Poor students, students of color, students who are otherwise don't have resources and support. And so if we focus on helping rather than controlling and punishing students, right, we might be able to disrupt some of this behavior. But instead, our policy of you misbehave, you get punished, which is not working, right? We seem to be all in on, and so there's more school safety officers in schools than guidance counselors. As of 2020, in New York City public schools, more police officers than guidance counselors. That doesn't seem like a system that's going to result in helping students so much as punishing students. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel kind of strongly about that one. But anyway, the idea is, right, within schools, poorer students, disadvantaged students, whatever it is, all around, are more likely to be seen as discipline problems than wealthier white kids, right? And so, for example, if you look at the number of suspensions that students get, African American boys are 4 times more likely to be suspended than white boys. I haven't seen research on girls, but and at all levels, like from daycare and preschool all the way up through high school, even when students display the exact same behavior, Low-income students or students of color are punished more frequently and more severely than their white counterparts. And again, the studies that have the evidence for this are listed in the book. I don't know the name of the study off the top of my head. And we know that suspending students is bad for them, right? Like if a kid is a behavioral problem, we tend to suspend them and get them out of the school to make our lives easier, right? But it actually is double a punishment on the student, because not only are they not learning their lesson about what they've done wrong, but they're also not getting as much instructional time as their peers. They're stigmatized, right, as bad kids, and that makes them more likely to disengage from school and not get everything out of it that they could. Some students who are suspended become ineligible for like clubs or sports or other curricular activities, right, or field trips. All those things, extracurricular activities, sports, field trips, those improve students' engagement, right? They improve learning outcomes, they improve students' excitement, and so we punish the kids that need it the most by saying, oh, you can't go on the field trip because you brought scissors to school last week or whatever, right? Like those kinds of the kids that need that attention and need that extra help end up not getting it because they're suspended or expelled or whatever. Questions or comments about discipline in schools? All right, one more and then we'll take a break. So the last one I want to talk about that contributes to inequality within schools is something called the hidden curriculum. So the curriculum is like the things that the school is teaching, right? So, first grade curriculum is reading and writing, whereas high school curriculum is Shakespeare and, fractions or whatever. And so the hidden curriculum is the unwritten lessons, the unwritten knowledge that kids gain, right? It's unwritten and sometimes unintended lessons about values and behaviors, right? All the kind of stuff that gets taught in schools that's not in the lesson plan. For example, in one school in Texas, the dress code was actually causing a lot of education to go on, right? Which was a dress code that penalized the kinds of clothes that Latina and Black girls were wearing in the district. And that kind of clothing, so it was like baggy jeans and sneakers, right? Those kinds of clothes were considered not undisciplined, what's the word I want? Unprofessional for the educational environment, right? But the kinds of clothes that the rich white girls were wearing, right, which also included baggy, clothing, those were not part of the dress code, right? And so like a student who goes to that school and sees a dress code that affects students of color but not white students, they're learning a lesson there that's not in any lesson plan, right? And so basically what the hidden curriculum often deals with is marginalized students, and that can be students of color, it could be LGBTQ students, it could be female students in a male-dominated situation, it could be poor students. They are always expected to conform to the larger group, right? They are taught, the hidden curriculum teaches them that their appearances, their personalities, their behaviors are at odds with dominant expectations. And so, in one school, teachers were regularly misidentifying Latino boys as being suspected as being in a gang because they were wearing Dickies brand pants, like Carhartts, right? It was just a fashion trend among Latino boys. It was borrowed probably from gang culture, right? But wearing that brand of pants got all these boys suspended for suspected gang behavior, right? Simply because they were wearing those pants. Now, the white And the Asian boys in the school who were wearing Dickies pants did not get turned in for suspected gang behavior, right? It was only the Latino kids. So, again, these are two dress code examples, but dress codes often teach us lessons that are not in any textbook, right? Does that make sense? Hidden curriculum is not just about dress codes. Those are just my example, but, we also learn that wealthy people have more power, and we learn that, the dollar, money is a big driver in society and other things too. All right, so I would like to take a break right here, and then when we come back, I want to talk about one other kind of inequality related to schools, and then we'll actually get to look at some solutions. We won't leave it here with just all the doom and gloom about the education system. We'll talk about some solutions, and then we'll wrap up with our participation activity for today. Alrighty? Okay, so I'll see you all in 10 minutes. So, in the second half today, I would like to talk about one more kind of inequality in schools, actually outside of school, but we'll get to it in a second. And then we'll talk about some of the solutions, some of the potential directions to solve some of these social problems. And then we'll wrap up today with our activity. So, I would like to talk about inequality outside of school. We've talked about inequality among schools, where some schools get better funding than others, and other schools are, more segregated or whatever. Then we talked about inequality inside of schools, like among the students and who gets treated how. But now I want to look at what happens outside of school. So, for example, in the summer, right, there is a well-known among educators phenomenon called summer slide, is what I always heard it called as, summer setback. Summer learning loss, right? Where kids who are not in school in summer forget some of the stuff they learned, right? It happens to all of us. And it's not always just in the summer. There's like a Christmas break slide too, for me anyway. But this is, a real thing, right? In the summer, kids kind of get set back a little. Well, it turns out that corresponds to socioeconomic status, that wealthier kids don't lose as much in the summer as poorer or lower class kids do. Partly because higher income students can go to day camp or visit a museum or travel to a state park or an aquarium or an art gallery or go to a play or a concert or do math or have a tutor, right? Like all those things are more easily accessible than low-income children who often don't have access to those things. And so not only do students lose some learning in the summer, but poorer kids lose more learning than kids with more resources. Similarly and relatedly, technology, especially in the modern era, technology can exacerbate resource and achievement gaps. We saw this during the pandemic, right, where technology was much easier to access in wealthier and in bigger school districts, right, where people in the county, in Aroostook County and Washington County, were having trouble getting access to reliable broadband internet in order to provide schooling. Low-income schools don't have as much capacity for, all the equipment and training and updates, right, to all their technology. I went to school in the computer era. I'm not that old. But our computer lab was all, it was just in the switchover from those Apple IIe's with the green screens and the big fat floppy disks. The switchover from those to like the first Office, Microsoft Office Windows type computers. But 20 years later, when I went back to the school, like, they still have the same ones that were there when I was a kid, right? Like, you know, schools don't always have the newest and best technology, but the wealthier schools can do that. And so, you know, technology can actually make the problem worse because poorer and rural schools can't access this, and so this gets worse, right? Does that make sense? So what do we do about all these problems in education? What do we do about segregation? What do we do about summer learning loss? What do we do about public and private school funding and all that? There's been a lot of reforms in education. You know, as long as there have been problems, there have been educational reformers. And some of these you know, reforms have worked better than others, and some are more realistic than others. But most educational reformers agree that there is a difference in pursuing educational equality and educational equity. So equality is a situation where you treat everyone the same as a way of being fair. So in an educational setting, this might include using the same teaching style to deliver the same material to all students in the same way, right? Or administering, you know, one standardized test to assess every student in the class, right? That would be equality. Everybody's being treated the same. The problem is, in education, not all students are equal, right? Some students need a little extra support in one area. Some students can have more independence in other areas. We talked, you know, about standardized testing, and that's not going to be very effective for kids, right? And using the same test for everyone. So what most educational reformers try to pursue is not equality. They actually try to pursue something called equity. Equity creates fairness by providing individuals and groups with what they need to be successful. So instead of treating everyone the same and calling it fair, even if the outcomes aren't fair, equity is a process where the outcomes are what's fair. Everybody gets to be successful, but they have different paths for getting there, right? So a classic meme or whatever on the internet that illustrates this difference is right here, right? That if there are three people who want to watch a baseball game or whatever, you know, look over a fence at an event, if we wanted to pursue equality, we could give each of them a box to stand on. And if we give them a box to stand on, then, you know, 2 out of 3 of them now can watch the game. But that's equality. We treated them all fairly, right? They all got a box. But equality does not result in equal outcomes, right? This student still can't succeed. If we pursue equity, every student is getting something different, right? This student's actually not getting any extra support. This student is getting double support, 2 boxes to stand on, and this student is getting something completely different, a ramp, right? Not even getting a box. So each student is treated differently. But the outcome is that it's all fair for everybody. Everybody gets to see the game now. Does that distinction make sense between equality and equity? And so most school reform is focused now on educational equity, because treating everybody the same doesn't work out, but treating everybody with fairness so that the outcome is the same, that's what we want to do. So does that make sense? Good. So one of the problems that we pointed out with respect to education was access, that not everybody around the world has equal access to a good education. So to solve that problem, we would want to expand access to education, and globally there is a lot of effort being put into expanding access to education. There's these large international organizations, like maybe you've heard of UNESCO, UNESCO, that's the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, Amnesty International, the World Bank. These are all international organizations who are some of the most well-known backers, like financial backers, of efforts to expand access to education. Even given that, there's still a persistent global education funding gap. Because there is such a strong need for educational dollars in low and middle income countries like Africa, many countries in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and in South America, because there is such a high need among those countries for global education money, there's still a large gap between the rich nations, the educationally rich nations, and the educationally poor nations. And so one of the ways to address that has been creating local initiatives to expand educational access. Maybe you remember Malala Yousafzai, the teenager from Pakistan who is now an activist for educational access, especially for girls and women. Malala is from Pakistan, and again, Pakistan is a country that has a persistent educational gap between women and boys and girls. There's not a lot of funding for education, and so the Malala Fund is, a local to the Middle East, right, initiative to expand access. There's, in the south of the United States, there are local initiatives in rural areas to try to get more kids enrolled in schools. Even though legally they're supposed to be in schools, not everybody is. And so there's often a lot of, nonprofits and things that try to engage students from those areas. So those are some of the ways that we are trying to expand access to education. Another issue we talked about was with this public school, private school, our choices are all flawed. Like there's problems with each kind of school. And so what we've seen in the last several years is an alternatives to the U.S. education system cropping up. There's been a significant increase in homeschooling, for example, right? For those that aren't aware, homeschooling is the practice of educating your children outside of the confines of school, right? Usually in your home, but it doesn't literally have to be in your physical home, but outside of the public or private school system. Excuse me. That is increasingly popular today. And of course, the pandemic also increased, temporarily anyway, increased rates of homeschooling. Another is charter schools. You may have heard of charter schools before. Charter schools are publicly funded schools. The government pays for them, and students can attend them for free. But they are run by private companies. Right? They're not run by the Department of Education. They're run by, for-profit companies. So charter schools were originally proposed as like this great innovation where, they're not held up by the confines of all the rules of the Department of Education. And so they can be really innovative and creative and do things differently. But unfortunately, what's happened is over about 20 or 30 years of charter schools being in existence, they become very standardized and almost like franchises. You know how like every McDonald's is a franchise, so they all look the same? Charter schools across the U.S. are really only run by like 2 or 3 companies now. And so every school looks the same. They're very standardized. They're not actually all that innovative. And, they may or may not be successful in educating students the same way. Ooh, excuse me, I don't know why I'm yawning. So some of these alternatives, homeschooling or charter schools, are ways we've devised to try to not be locked into the U.S. education system as it currently is. Because we do rightfully have a sense that it's not working, as best as it can. Sometimes one way to improve like losing summer, education and things like that is to supplement classroom instruction. So, for example, many schools last summer especially increased their summer programming, right? So because we were so concerned about students not really completing the spring, semester because of the pandemic very, very solidly, many schools, developed certainly like their summer school, right? That's obviously summer programming, but also like summer reading programs, other kinds of like, reset, even like students that can come and hang out at the school in the summer and play, have recess and learn some basic, refresher stuff before school starts again, that kind of thing. Another way schools are adjusting is by changing how students and teachers spend their time during the school day. So, for example, it used to be very rigid in terms of sitting still in rows and not talking, and then you had like 15 minutes of recess where kids were expected to just get it all out and then go back in and sit very rigidly and blah, 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 right? Now there's a lot of research that shows, more informal learning settings. You can have the beanbag chairs or whatever for, where students can walk around if they need to get their jitters out as long as they're respectful. There was a school in Texas that was pairing, like every time students had good behavior, like they, said thank you or they did something that was on a list, right? They could earn extra recess time. So the more polite they were, give them 5 extra minutes at recess or whatever, that kind of thing. Unstructured playtime, as any child psychologist will tell you, promotes learning and health, right? Every moment spent in school does not need to be spent in a lecture-style instruction, environment, right? Kids learn out on the playground as much as they learn in the classroom. Giving students music and art time, right, improves their learning outcomes in other areas like math. Because they're given that outlet for that energy, they can then focus on math when it's math time, and right, all those kinds of things are, interplay together. Questions or comments? So here's an example of a place that really did this, that really changed how schooling and children's experiences worked. And so it's called the Harlem Children's Zone, and as its name suggests, it's found in Harlem, New York City. It began in the 1990s as a one-block experiment. So in one city block where there was a school and I think a healthcare facility of some kind, but they turned this block into a children's zone, which is basically it improves educational outcomes by providing a ton of different supports besides just a school. Right, so the Harlem, in this one block radius, which is now over 100 blocks, there is, in addition to schools, there are healthcare facilities, family education facilities, social services, and other facilities like a gym, a pool, a music room, right, a theater. All of these facilities are open to anyone in the neighborhood. Right, any child. You don't have to be enrolled in a particular school, right? It's just anyone in the area. And by doing this, they've actually improved the graduation rates. Everybody who goes through these programs is graduating high school. So I do have a very quick video clip from their website to show you, just illustrating the children's zone. Hang on here. So here's their website. I think there's a link on Brightspace, but oops. Go away. Their mission. Wait, hold on. The full screen didn't work. I'm going to open it in YouTube. It's easier.
Harlem is a magical place to me. You just always hear music. Harlem is a magical place to me. You just always hear music. Every single day you're gonna hear music.
When I think about Harlem, I think about the phoenix that rose from the ashes.
I describe Harlem as a family.
I'm definitely proud of being from Harlem. I wouldn't want to be from anywhere else.
And it said it took a village to raise the children. Harlem Children's Zone was our village. And I knew somewhere down that somebody was going to do something good for Harlem.
Harlem has always been the epicenter of black culture.
Harlem was a place where a lot of black people were able to climb up out of the negative space.
When people thought about the future of black people, they thought it was going to happen in Harlem.
These blocks are literally history lessons in terms of who lived here, the work that was done, the fun. It was happening in Harlem, but then something happened.
It started with poverty and it ended with drugs. Harlem was clearly falling down and you could see the decay.
At the time, about 1 in 10 children in Central Harlem were going into foster care.
Harlem had abandoned buildings and trash all over everywhere. This sends a signal to kids. No one cares about you. Here, your life is a toss-up.
We're looking at the prison to be a panacea for all that ailed the community. In many instances, society chases smoke, but refuses to put out the fire. Reedland began to develop programs that address the fire and not the smoke.
I don't know about you, but I'm tired of hearing about my children dying in New York, and the children dying in Boston, and the children dying in Philadelphia. I think it's time for some of us to stand up and rebuild America community by community.
Marian Wright Edelman had pulled together about 20, 25 leaders from across the country to talk about the plight of black children.
And we would go off into a retreat. It's Alex Haley's farm.
And Marian said, Jeff, this is it. This is where we're going to launch our crusade.
Thus began the Harlem Children's Zone.
We thought that it may not be easy, but it had to be us. We were willing to put whatever it takes to make a change here in Harlem.
Doing any one thing was simply not going to allow children to reach their full potential. I've been trying to figure out how to meet some people who could help us with this mission. And someone said, well, do you know Stan Druckenmiller? Stan Druckenmiller has more money than God.
And I said, Jeff, that's like the most fantastic, unbelievable vision I've ever heard. It's a little crazy, but I'm willing to bet on it. I was all in.
Jeff said, if you put this money in, I promise you we will deliver these results. And if we don't, you can essentially have your money back.
What we were trying to do here at the Harlem Children's Zone was to create a counter-narrative to what people thought about black and brown children in Harlem or in any other community around this nation, because we think we have a model that can be replicated in other places.
And that's why, when I'm president of the United States of America, the first part of my plan to combat urban poverty will be to replicate the Harlem Children's Zone in 20 cities across the country.
Hi, guys. Good morning.
The ultimate goal of the Harlem Children's Zone is to end generational poverty. We definitely feel like we are doing that because we are sending hundreds of young people off to college and connecting them to a livable wage in a way that didn't happen before.
Being in an environment with individuals that care so much about the students that we serve, the families that we serve, that care so much about the mission, have personal stories that connect them to the work that we do, that really sacrifice so much on behalf of the children and families of Harlem. Like, this is the environment I want to be put in.
This is it. We are finally done forever. But not done forever because you know HED follows you for the rest of your life.
When I go in and I see those kids walking across that stage, I say to myself, we did good.
Right. So just an illustration of this group as a way of trying to deal with some of the issues that we talked about as problems with education. So maybe grassroots, communities can make the changes themselves. Another way we can deal with the funding issue is by looking at the government, right? So the government's, the one that decided that funding should come from neighborhoods, right? And the students should be drawn from the local neighborhoods. So the government isn't blind to the fact that that means that poor neighborhoods will have poorer schools. And so they created what's called the Title I program. The Title I program allocates federal aid to schools with large proportions of low-income students. So schools that don't get a lot of money from their property taxes may get supplemental funds from the government in the form of Title I grants to try to make up for some of the shortcomings between the wealthier schools and the poorer schools. In general, that funding is used for evidence-based practices that increase student achievement and increase parental involvement. Sometimes the programs that are funded are like aimed at specific student groups, like those most at risk of failing, or women, girls, or something like that. So sometimes these Title I funds are used to target specific student groups, and sometimes it's just the entire school. It depends what they're going for. So we can embrace the Title I model that the federal government has to sort of address some of the issues with funding. Another way is to reform this property tax-based funding structure. Not every state does it that way, right? So every state has their own education system, right? That's a state-run system. And most do property taxes, but not all. For example, in Wyoming, everybody's property taxes get added together and put in a pool. And then every school in the state gets an equal cut of that pool. So instead of like the, Cape Elizabeth and Falmouth taxpayers, their money going to those schools, the Cape Elizabeth and Falmouth taxpayers and the Washington County and Aroostook County taxpayers, all their money goes into the same pot, and all the schools in Aroostook and Androscoggin and Cumberland County all get the same amount. Does that make sense? So that's an interesting way, right? So instead of doing it by neighborhood, it's still property taxes, but it's divided up more equally. That's a cool model, although there is a problem with this model, which is whenever there is like an issue that affects the entire state's economy, the tax revenue earmarked for education also dwindles. So in Wyoming, for example, mining is a very popular, it's a very common industry, mining for, metals and stuff. And the mining industry is in decline. And so whenever the mining industry has a really tough year, like every school in the state suffers instead of maybe just some schools, right? So, you have to kind of weigh those pros and cons. But the point is, you don't have to have the system that we think of as the only way to fund schools, right? Another system that has been proposed to deal with this is what are called voucher programs. In voucher programs, funding that's typically designated for public schools instead goes to individual families. And then those families use that money towards a private school's tuition. So in a voucher program, basically what happens is the state gives a family whatever amount of money, remember I said they might spend $8,000 on a student in a year or whatever, right? Well, they give the family $8,000 instead of instead of putting it into the school. And then the family uses that $8,000 to pay for their kid to go to, private school or whatever. People who are advocates for the voucher program system argue that families should be granted more say over how their education dollars are used. And so the system puts the power in their hands, right? They get the money and they can decide how it should be used to educate their child. On the other hand, most critics allege that the voucher program actually depletes resources. What happens with voucher programs is all the money comes from public schools. They take the money away from public schools and then give it to the families who then give it to private schools. And so what happens is the public schools get worse and worse and worse. Less and less and less funding because the vouchers take that money away. And so most studies find that students who receive vouchers to attend private schools actually perform worse on standardized tests than students who attend public schools. So they don't even work, right? So it's difficult to find solutions to how to fund schools. If voucher programs don't work, and if reallocating funding, like a pool system could be risky, right? I don't know what other solutions are out there, right? These are the ones that have been proposed so far. So funding continues to be a very serious, fundamental issue in our education system right now. Last but not least, the book talks about the teaching profession. So one of the issues that was raised was how students of color and students from other marginalized backgrounds like low income or LGBT or whatever, how they're often marginalized by the school system. One of the ways to combat that problem is to have more teachers who are also from marginalized backgrounds, right? Recruiting underrepresented populations into the teaching professions. We should have more teachers who are low income or were low income growing up. We should have more teachers of color. We should have more LGBTQ teachers. We should have more English as a second language teachers. We should have, teachers that reflect the diversity of students that they're serving. Right? Teachers with learning disabilities or teachers who had other, obstacles to overcome. And not just teachers, really recruiting school staff. So teachers, yes, but administrators, staff like lunch ladies, lunch personnel, librarian staff, coaches, right? Everybody who's in the school has backgrounds resembling those of the students. It makes for a richer learning experience, right? Representation matters. Recent research illustrates that having just one black teacher in elementary school reduces the dropout rate of high school black boys by 40%. Having one black teacher in their elementary school years means that almost half of those students will graduate. They won't drop out. Black boys and girls with at least one same-race teacher during these grades also reported much higher expectations of college attendance. If you see other people who look like you being successful, having jobs, having gone to college, you're more likely to think you can do that. But if you're a black student faced by only white teachers who have gone to college, you might assume college is not for people like you, right? So the more diverse that school teaching and other staff can be, the more opportunities there are for students to see opportunity. Questions or comments about some of these possible reforms to education? Or some of the, not issues, but some of the solutions being raised. Good. So, in terms of your assignments for today, the first one is to go to the discussion board, as I pointed out at the beginning, and talk to your fellow classmates who have posted really interesting information about different problems in education, the mix of education and the economy, the funding issues, and leadership issues related to schools. So that's one thing you have to do. And the other is the participation assignment for today. This one's going to be easy. This is all just asking you to reflect. So there are 4 questions. What are some lessons that you did not learn through formal schooling? In other words, like, I learned that the neighbor's dog was mean, right? I didn't learn that through schooling. So tell me a lesson that you learned that wasn't through school. And then can you think of an example of when your informal education and formal schooling conveyed the same lesson? Like sometimes did they match up, real life and school? Did they teach you the same lesson? What makes a school good or bad? How did your school expect students to learn outside of school hours? What might it look like to implement a principle of equity in a school? So these are all your personal opinion, based on your personal experience. That's okay to get as personal as you choose to in your responses to this. But that's it. You just have to answer them with your own, thoughts and interests. One thing I'll mention is if you download the document, it says Fall 20 here. That's just an error. It's the right one. It's the right document. I just forgot to change the name of it. So don't worry about that. But these are the questions. So does anyone have any questions about the assignment for today? Reflecting on your own personal, experience in education and talking to your friends, your classmates on the discussion board. All right. So that's it. That's all I've got for today. Next time on Thursday, we will talk about health and medicine, health and healthcare as our final social problem in society. So if you haven't posted your presentation to the discussion board yet, then I'm going to assume your topic is health and healthcare. So make sure you get that posted by Thursday. But thank you to all of you who have posted already. That's great. And so next time we'll talk about health and healthcare, and then the last week of class is quickly going to be upon us. And we will have one final lecture on Tuesday, and then the final exam. All right? Okay, well, enjoy your afternoons, everybody, and I'll see you all on Thursday.